Even today, its relationship to Jammu, which falls within Hindustan, is deep. End quote. He further argued that not only were Pandits the real and ancient inhabitants of the Mulk who were brought to the land by Kashyap Rishi, but they were also one of the finest communities of Aryavarta, or the land of the Aryas. As a result, the text claims Kashmir for all Hindus. Quote, Hindus consider Kashmir the earth's head and eyes, and more sacred than any other land because it holds all their tirthas or pilgrimage sites on its surface. End quote. It points out further that Muslims too considered it a paradise on earth and called it Baghe Suleiman because they believed that prophets Moses and Solomon passed through Kashmir and the shrines and tombs of Muslim saints dotted its landscape. However, that Khasta considered Kashmir a specifically Hindu sacred space, the land of the ancient Aryans, and the font of Hindu culture is evident from his detailed descriptions of the ruins of ancient temples, such as Avantipura, Parihaspura, and so on, as well as Kashmir Sanskrit scholars, including Keshamendra, Kalhan, Jonaraj, Abhinav Gupta, and so on. The Persian narrative tradition within Kashmir, however, as mentioned earlier, resisted such easy categorizations, even though it drew on Urdu vernacular culture. Indeed, even as the volumes on the 19th century Kashmiri tarikhs dedicated to Sufi mystics and the celebration of Kashmir as an Islamic space are replete with the idea of Kashmir as sacred space long before the advent of Islam and Sufi mysticism on its spiritual landscape. Tariq-e-Hasan, a multi-volume Persian history of Kashmir written in the 1880s by Pir Hasan Shah Khoyami, is replete with praises of Kashmir as a blessed landscape and a repository of literary knowledge prior to its transition to Islam. In its section on Rishis, the indigenous mystics, in the volume on mystics and friends of God, the text notes that Islam fit naturally on the Kashmiri spiritual landscape because Kashmir had already been the land of beings who had withdrawn from material life and dedicated themselves to meditation and spiritual pursuits. The fame of Kashmir as a sacred space could not stay hidden long from the giants of Islam, who eventually made their way there and converted the rishis with the force of their spirituality. Similarly, the text volume on Persian poets of Kashmir acknowledges Kashmir as a center of knowledge and education since the time of its inhabitation by humans. With the advent of the Aryans, ancient Kashmir, according to the text, produced scholars of the Vedas. Once Sanskrit emerged as a literary language, Kashmiris took its study and learning to great heights, producing mature and renowned scholars of Sanskrit. Furthermore, the text emphasizes the influence of Kashmir's landscape and unique literary sensibilities on Persian once it became the literary language. This allowed Kashmiri Persian poets to produce verses of a high caliber that could rival poetry from Persia itself, not just in terms of style but also content. So even in the late 19th century, Kashmir's Persian historical tradition continued to imagine itself as part of a longer narrative tradition that was a product of multiple linguistic and spiritual influences. Here one can see the entity Kashmir that had been imagined and created through its narrative culture, now itself imagining its own literary past. This is not to suggest, of course, that Kashmiri tarikhs did not attempt to negotiate Kashmir's relationship to Hindustan and British India. Not surprisingly, the text raised two related questions, albeit implicitly. Where did Kashmir fit within the larger structures of British India, and who would represent the majority of Kashmiris, given that the immediate rulers not only did not share their religion, but were also outsiders? Their narratives of Kashmir's political past, however, recognized not only that Kashmir had been part of numerous imperial entities, but that its very uniqueness had been shaped by its interactions with a variety of regions, people, goods, ideas. So Tariq-e-Birbal Kachu, the same text that I've been talking about, for instance, lauded Sultan Zainul Abidin, who ruled Kashmir from 1420 to 1470, for making Kashmir the center of a vast networks of exchanges of scholars, Sufi mystics, manuscripts, gifts, goods that included Gujarat, Tibet, Persia, Khorasan, Baghdad, and even Mecca. Indeed, one of the main charges of the text, that the text levels against certain Afghan governors, much like earlier and later authors of Persian and Kashmiri narratives, it described Afghan rule as an unremitting disaster for Kashmir. But one of the main charges that it levels against Afghan rule was that they caused a disruption in trading networks, thus renting asunder Kashmir's links with surrounding regions and reducing its traders to penury. At one time, the text notes, Kashmiri traders had links to places all over the world, such as Hindustan, Tibet, Kashgar, Persia, and Afghan rule had severed those ties. At this point, the text breaks into a Masnavi on tea. Masnavi is a long narrative poem, which describes in detail how the salty tea that was drunk in Kashmir after every meal, noon chai, was introduced to the land from Tibet and became a Kashmiri delicacy. For Kachru, tea symbolized one of the many foreign influences that had been naturalized in Kashmir that defined it and its distinct culture. Similarly, Tariq Hassan's geography volume links the emergence of shawl manufacture in Kashmir to its geographical location at the crossroads of religious and economic networks. According to the text, Kashmiris were unaware of the existence of Pashmina wool until Sayyid Ali Hamdani, significantly also the Sufi mystic from Central Asia who introduced Islam to Kashmir, purportedly according to these texts, discovered its warmth and softness in Ladakh. Since he was on his way to Kashmir to spread the true message of Islam at the time, he brought the wool back to Kashmir and had it woven into cloth. This led the Kashmiri ruler at the time, Sultan Qutbuddin, who was amazed by the durability and fineness of the cloth, to begin the tradition of shawl weaving in Kashmir. The text thus relates Kashmir's geographical position to its people's ability to produce fine goods, which is in turn linked to the much more significant transformation of Kashmir into an Islamic landscape. Ultimately, the 19th century Tariqs were themselves embodiments of Kashmir's long and connected historical tradition, as they displayed a narrative palimpsest that gives the reader a sense of the diversity of linguistic and regional influences that went into its making and into fashioning Kashmir itself. Kashmir emerged in these texts as a sacred territorial and historical space created and maintained as a literary idea, at once local and universal, with defined contours and yet an integral part of wider sacred and political geographies. I would suggest then that not only was Kashmir a literary borderland created by the narrative imagination, but it was as much a borderland for the narrative imagination. Thank you. Go ahead, Neelish.
I'll start if nobody else
Yeah, sure. I have a question too. You can start.
You mentioned one of the texts, there was this awareness of British Orientalist activity, and I'm wondering if you could comment on circulation, the rise of publishing, perhaps later, however it happens in the Kashmiri sense, how is knowledge being reproduced and circulated, and what does it have to do with the rise of modern knowledge formations throughout British India?
Okay. You know, the way that a part of the way that these texts are circulating is, you know, they all, you know, obviously circulate in a manuscript culture, right? But there's also a very strong. There's something that I kind of pointed to in the very beginning of the paper. There's a symbiosis between sort of the oral and performative traditions in this period, especially with the emergence of Kashmiri as being a language, which, you know, starting really at the turn of the 19th century, it becomes you know, a language that is, you know, a lot more Persian texts are being translated into Kashmiri, and then those texts in Kashmiri are then performed by storytellers and all manner of oral, you know, performers, and that's, you know, one way in which this is happening. But in the 19th century, there's sort of a parallel engagement that's going on with these colonial Orientalists who sort of discover Kashmir in the early 19th century, you know, as a place, you know, that is a repository of all these Sanskrit texts, and, you know, they kind of missed it in you know, up to that moment, and you know, they come into Kashmir, and in the first half of the 19th century, they basically you know, translate the Rajtarangini into Sanskrit, and begin its fame as the only history of Kashmir written in British India and so on. But this gathers steam really in the latter half of the 19th century, when you have these, you know, massive tours for the collection of Sanskrit manuscripts, not just Rajtarangini, but all manner of Sanskrit manuscripts. And, you know, what really ends up happening is that, you know, a lot of these Persian texts are, obviously the authors of these Persian narratives are aware of what's going on. But what's happening is that they are being consistently throughout this process being marginalized, because there's a break that is being introduced between the Sanskrit and the Persian tradition in this period. You know, so this continuity, at least in the colonial Orientalist sort of framework, you know, doesn't exist, right? So so you have Kalhan, right, with Rajtarangini, and then suddenly nothing else because these Persian texts are not really talked about, at least in the colonial Orientalist framework.
Is there a reason why they're not interested in these texts and they're only interested in the Sanskrit or in envisioning Kashmir in that way? Is there a reason why?
Well,